This video is brought to you by Nebula. When Westerners imagine the Chinese economy, they usually think about millions of STEM graduates working in hyper-automated factories and living in sprawling neon-lit metropoles. But while this might approximate life in Shanghai or Beijing, China's cities are actually just tiny islands of prosperity in what's otherwise a mostly rural and conspicuously poor country. In reality though, if we include rural migrants working in urban areas under China's hukou system, nearly 2/3 of the Chinese population, or about 900 million people, live in rural areas, mostly villages in the Chinese countryside. Most of these people have less than a high school education, live on a monthly wage of less than 2,000 yuan, equivalent to about $200, and often work on a small family-run farm. In fact, China has by far and away the most urban-rural divide in the entire world, and this is the main reason why. Despite being a nominally communist country, China also has some of the world's most economic inequality more generally. So in this video we're going to have a look at China's economic inequality, the urban-rural divide, and why this presents both an economic and a political problem for the CCP. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into the urban-rural divide, let's just start by taking a look at China's economic inequality more generally. There are loads of ways to measure economic inequality, but perhaps the most popular is the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is usually applied to income, and it goes from 0 to 1. A Gini coefficient of 0, for example, describes a world of perfect equality, where everyone has identical incomes, while a Gini coefficient of 1 describes a world where one person has all the money while everyone else has none. The maths behind the Gini coefficient is a little bit complicated, so we're not going to go into it in full, but the basic idea can be illustrated using graphs. Take a perfectly equal population of 3 people, where everyone earns the same amount, let's say £1. If you plot a graph that cumulatively measures the share of income against the fraction of the population, it'll just be a straight line at 45 degrees. The first person has £1, 2 people together have £2, 3 people have £3. Now, imagine that this population is a bit less equal. There's still a total of £3 going around, but the first person has £0, the second has £1, and the third person has £2. This graph is no longer a straight line. Instead, it sort of curves upwards. The first person has £0, 2 together have £1, and all 3 together have £3. The Gini coefficient essentially measures the area between those two lines. When it's perfectly equal, there's no space between the two lines, so it's 0, and when the last person has all the money, the area between the two lines is just the entire area underneath the first line, so it's 1. Interestingly, China's Gini coefficient is far higher than that of Western economies. Official data from China's National Bureau of Statistics suggests that China has a Gini coefficient of about 0.46, which, according to World Bank data, would make it the most unequal large economy in the world, apart from South Africa and Brazil. However, well-versed China analysts have expressed skepticism about China's official data, and survey data from independent think tanks, namely the China Family Panel Studies, suggest that it's nearer to 0.57, which would make China the third most unequal economy in the world, behind just South Africa and Namibia. Inequality basically began rising after Deng Xiaoping's opening up reforms in the late 70s and early 80s, which introduced capitalist elements to China's nominally communist economy. Deng's reforms were immensely successful, and China's economy would go on to enjoy unprecedented and exponential growth for the next few decades. However, without a strong welfare state or worker protections, which still don't exist today in part because Xi apparently thinks that welfarism makes people lazy, China's newfound wealth isn't effectively redistributed. Deng's reforms, which basically transformed China from a predominantly rural agrarian economy to an urban industrial economy, also exacerbated China's rural-urban divide, which is the main cause of China's inequality. There was already a rural-urban divide in the Mao era, but it wasn't as stark as it would become, and only about 15% of China's population lived in urban areas, so it didn't have as much of an effect on China's Gini coefficient. From 1980 until 2020, though, China experienced the most rapid urbanization in world history, and the percentage of Chinese people living in cities rose from about 20% to nearly 70%. although about 35% of these are migrants who've moved from rural areas to urban areas in search of work, and under China's hukou system are therefore ineligible for social welfare and various public services in those urban areas. Because rural people are already poorer than urbanites, the hukou system actually exacerbates inequality within China, and the CCP Central Policy Committee have actually been asking provincial governments to scrap the system for a while now. But provincial governments have resisted because they know that reform would be resisted by middle-class urbanites, sort of like Chinese NIMBYs who benefit from the current system. Inequality in China actually has many of the same dynamics as it does in the West. As well as the urban-rural divide, China's super expensive property market also serves to exacerbate inequality by restricting home ownership to those with parental help. And there's a growing sense that China's education system is being gamed by wealthy parents who can afford to pay for expensive tutoring. Anyway, this combination of a lack of redistributive mechanisms, an inequality-inducing hukou system, and the fact that China's economic growth was concentrated in its urban centres has created the world's worst urban-rural divide. Today, the average Chinese worker in Shanghai makes 12 times that of someone living in rural Gansu. To put this in context via an American analogy, the median salary in urban Manhattan is less than 4 times that of rural West Virginia, and people still think that America has a politically unpalatable urban-rural divide. Anyway, this creates a number of problems for the CCP. First, the poverty of China's rural population is one of the big reasons behind China's chronically weak domestic demand, which, as we've explained in other videos, is the root cause of many of their current economic woes. And second, China's massive and undereducated rural population is one of the main reasons that some economists think it's at risk of falling into the so-called middle-income trap, which refers to the fact that many middle-income countries struggle to move up the value chain, and data suggests that education is the main reason. The few countries that did make the leap from middle to high income in the 20th century, like Taiwan, South Korea, Ireland and Israel, all had conspicuously higher education levels compared to those that didn't. Thanks to the fact that only a tiny minority of rural kids finished school, in 2015 only 30% of the Chinese labour force had a high school education, lower than even those countries like South Africa or Mexico that got stuck in the middle income trap. All in all, the CCP clearly has a lot on its plate, and even if it can solve the country's more immediate economic problems, China's future prosperity and stability will require closing the urban-rural divide. There's definitely going to be some new developments with this story though, so keep an eye out for future developments. Anyway, the best way to stay on top of the news is with Nebula News. If you haven't heard, we've launched a project alongside our partners at Nebula called Nebula News, where every day the TLDR team curates a selection of videos that matter most in the world right now. As you surely already know, Nebula is the thoughtful streaming service that's pushing boundaries on what independent creators can do with their content, including Nebula News, where we handpick a feed of content which should help you keep up to date with everything you need to know to sound smart and be truly informed. We believe that in a confusing and overwhelming news environment, knowing what to pay attention to is important. You can't track every story, so our curation should help to surface what really matters, showing you videos from TLDR and other superb creators that help you understand the world around you quickly and easily. It's not just curated news content brought to you directly by us. Nebula also features loads of exclusive original content. That's things like Real Life Law's brand new series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts to keep you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. Now, if you've already subscribed to Nebula, you can find the brand new Nebula News section at nebula.tv/news. And be sure to bookmark or save that link so you can use it as your TLDR-ified news homepage. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. That's less than £2 a month. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out. We've got some really great feedback from existing members, so I hope you enjoy all the effort we're going to with Nebula News.